Hello, welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, depending where you're joining us from. Welcome to day 2 of the ICC International Trade and Prosperity Week, looking at sustainable global value chains. Today, we are going to be talking about model contracts and contract clauses. Before we start the session, I just wanted to say thank you to some of our supporters and our sponsors for this conference. Yesterday, we met in person at Diageo's offices, so thank you ever so much to Diageo for hosting us yesterday. We also have our sponsors ESG 360 and Halion, who have been supporters and are members of the ICC in the UK, so thank you to those too. We also yesterday launched our global toolkit, which is a toolkit which helps and shares insights into guidance on sustainability, climate change, giving some really interesting business case studies, and also a bit more information about who the ICC are, what we do on a global level, and just some tips as well for SMEs who are looking at starting their ESG journey. So I do recommend that you download the toolkit. If you use the QR code that's on your screen, it'll take you straight to it. I'd now like to introduce our moderator for today, Becky Annison. She is the Head of Engagement at the Chancery Lane Project, and she will be taking this event forward. Hi, Becky.
Hello, thank you so much. I hope everyone can hear me all right. Thank you very much for coming to the Model Contract Clauses webinar, and thank you to the ICC for hosting it. Just a tiny little bit of housekeeping first is that if you have an interesting question on the things we're discussing as we go through, then please do put it in the Q&A section and we'll try and get to it as we go. And just to kind of give you a little bit of a preamble, a little taster for how this is going to be, I just wanted to kind of talk very briefly and just sort of say, I think that contracts are one of the most powerful tools that we have available to us for helping the climate crisis, for helping companies to reach their climate goals, net zero targets, SBTI targets. And we're going to get today into some of the real practicalities around how you can do that and why they're so useful. Some really, really great speakers. Great speakers who I'm going to be poised to ask to introduce themselves. But before I do that, I'm Becky Annison. I'm Head of Engagement at the Chancery Lane Project, but before that I was an in-house lawyer for 12 years dealing with commercial contracts, particularly outsourcing contracts. But now I'm going to pass over to my other colleagues to introduce themselves.
Hello everyone, good morning. My name is Colin Telford. I work for Natwest Group. I'm a senior solicitor here. Natwest, for those of you who might not know, is one of the biggest banks in the UK. I come to you all very relieved this morning. I had a dentist appointment at 8:30 and I was terrified I was going to need some sort of treatment which would have made this more difficult. Fortunately, it was just a checkup. The two things that I'm also conscious of this morning. So one is my situation. I work in a big PLC which made climate part of its purpose, which drives everything 3 years ago. So I'm actually in a situation where it's quite easy to do some of this stuff. I know that's not the case for everyone. I know there will be a mix of entities represented by the delegates today, but I'll just talk to my experience and hopefully that's helpful. I'm also very conscious of my accent. There are 45 countries at the last count represented today. I will try my best. I've got a note telling me to speak slowly because I do know I have a very strong accent. So I'll do my best to speak in as clear English as I can. But I'll pass over to Gabrielle.
Hi everyone, my name is Gabrielle Guinier. I'm Head of Environmental Sustainability at BT Group. I'm actually Swedish, so I hope my accent is okay for everybody. I've been in this role at BT for about 14 years. I sit in Group Corporate Affairs and primarily look after strategy, thought leadership, and external advocacy. And I'll hand over to Emily.
Great, thanks so much. I am actually with ICC headquarters, so I am colleagues of the wonderful organizers, not only of this event, but the producers of that great toolkit that you saw the QR code for. I have not looked at it. I'm very excited. I am a lawyer. I'm a US lawyer, so I guess I have a neutral accent, and I have to say, Colin, for a Scot, your accent is very easy to understand. I run our commercial law and practice commission in the global policy department. So I am alone on this panel, not a sustainability expert, but you'll see my remarks will have a sort of other perspective coming in a bit later. And we work on model clauses, general commercial contracts, and the Incoterms rules, which some of you may know. So let me turn it over to Simon, please.
Thanks, Emily. Welcome everyone. So my name is Simon Antony. I work for Telstra within their procurement team. For those that don't know Telstra, it's a telecommunications company based out of Melbourne, Australia. Unfortunately, I'm not dialing in from Australia, but hello if there is anyone dialing in late at night from Australia. I'm actually based in the UK, leading Telstra's Scope 3 program. And back to you, Becky.
Fantastic. Well, as a lawyer, I'm always very keen to define terms before we start any sort of conversation. So I was hoping that, Colin, you would kick us off by describing what do we mean by model contract clauses?
Yeah, thanks, Becky. I think in a session around model contract clauses, it's probably a good place to start with what do we mean by that. So for me, classically, model contract clauses would be fixed contract clauses which would be used for maybe a specific industry or a specific risk. And an example I would give is the EU's model contract clauses for data transfers outside of the EU. They're dropped into a contract where there will be such a data transfer. The parties are not able to negotiate. They have to look at the obligations and make sure that they can meet those. And so in effect, those model contract clauses are like the rules of the road that everybody has agreed should apply. In the sustainability space, we're not at that point yet. And I think it's important for me today's session. We talk about the kind of state of play at the moment and everything's couched in what's the real world. So I also think a theme that will come through is we don't have time on our side. We can't wait for industry level clauses to develop. We should be doing what we can to get on with becoming more sustainable now. I'm sure that can sound very daunting. And what I wanted to point to is you will see in Becky's background, the Chancery Lane project. Becky's far too polite to give that a hard sell on a session like this, but I'm happy to speak to our experience. So if you're not aware of the Chancery Lane project, get on their website. It's a whole load of excellent resources which have been put together by lawyers almost on a pro bono basis. There are within that contract terms that you can use, which are ready, they're free to access, and so steering into a big topic is a brilliant starting point in terms of trying to work out what can you do within a particular organisation. And that was certainly our journey. We were inspired by what the Chancery Lane project had done. We created our own clauses around sustainability, which are now part of all the contracts that we enter into with suppliers. And so when I talk about model clauses today, I'm talking about the clauses that we've developed, which we use essentially the starting point of every negotiation, of which we to encapsulate what it is that we expect our suppliers to be doing.
No, that's fantastic. And I just also wanted to kind of echo your point you made there about not having very much time. I don't want to get into the details of the climate crisis too much, but one thing I think is always worth bringing up when we talk about contracts and we talk about the climate crisis is that whatever deadlines science has given us on the climate crisis, whatever deadlines are in the Paris Agreement, the point of contracts is that you lock parties into terms. So if you have a 7-year contract that you have signed today that has no climate related, no sustainability, no ESG clauses in it, it will be 7 years before you can open that up again. And that starts to run us very dangerously close to some of the interim deadlines that science is giving us. So one of the kind of the little warnings that I wanted to give today is when you look at the timescales around this, they are shorter than you think because you cannot get into contracts once they're signed. So it's just a little note of warning from me, but I want to get into some of the real practicalities around this because I think there's some real juice there. And I want to go to Gabrielle next. How do contract clauses slot into the wider program? You know, if you put any contract clause into a supply chain contract without going through a good process first, it's likely to fail and the suppliers are breaching it and you're not going to get what you want. So how do you use contract clauses as part of that wider engagement program?
Yeah, and I wanted to just start by setting a bit of context. So for us as BT or British Telecom, when we look at our end-to-end carbon footprint, only 6% of that comes from our own operations. 20% come from customers using our products and services, so whether they're using broadband or a phone or whatever, but 73% come from our upstream supply chain. So for us to reach net zero, we really need to engage with our suppliers and get them to net zero. So we do a number of things. We have a supplier assessment. We use our purchasing power. So about 15% of our adjudication criteria is linked to sustainability and to human rights. All our suppliers undergo a pre-assessment before they're onboarded about their sustainability performance. In the summer, we launched a supplier net zero campaign. So we reached out to our top 140 suppliers by carbon and talked to them about, net zero, carbon, why is it important? How does it fit in BT's strategy? How do you fit? And we also did a training program with CDP, or the Carbon Disclosure Project, again, about this whole thing and about disclosing and reporting. And CDP is something that we've been part of since the inception in terms of its supply chain program. So it's something that we, ask all our suppliers to disclose too. But coming back to contract clauses, so why do them? Where do they fit in, and how are they a bit different? I think for me, it really means to suppliers that we're serious about this. It's now part of a contract, and it's a good time to insert this requirement. So basically, you're talking to the supplier about a commercial contract, and then you say, well, actually, if you want this contract, if you want to do business with BT, there is this sustainability contract clause. And I think how that has changed some of the discussions that we're having is that, it could be me and the sustainability team talking to a sustainability team about carbon footprinting. But now it's actually part of a contract. So it's on a different level. It goes for different type of reviews, and it just puts a different focus on what we're trying to achieve.
Fantastic. I think now's probably a good time to give people a flavour of what those clauses might entail. And I know that, Simon, you've been using some at Telstra for a while now, and I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Yeah, definitely. And another quick plug for the Chancery Lane project. And like Colin said, their website has an exhaustive library of free climate clauses and more. In my experience at Telstra, it's about adapting those clauses to your business. So at Telstra, most of our emissions are concentrated on a relatively small number of suppliers. Therefore, meaningful decarbonisation targets from those suppliers contribute greatly towards Telstra achieving our Scope 3 target of 50% by 2030. It was last year that we launched Telstra's new standard emissions reduction clause. And this clause consists of two different sections. So the first component is a quantifiable emissions reduction target in support with that 2030 target that I mentioned. And then the second component is focused on obtaining complete and verified emissions reporting from our suppliers. So I've got very much the target and the measurement there as those two key sections. It's as I said, it's been about a year now, and we have 40 suppliers that have signed up to these new clauses. If I could just, one key learning from this past year is that the climate clauses, we found it's not a one size fits all. We very much need to consider things like the industry, geographic regions, as well as where suppliers are on their own decarbonisation pathway. So I think once we kind of had these model clauses, it was very much then about also trying to work with our suppliers to adapt them based on where they are and their level of maturity.
And what about getting them into contracts from the kind of the corporate side of things, Simon? How has that been?
That's been a much longer journey, really. So we've been engaging with our supply chain on climate change since 2020. So similar to BT, working in partnership with the CDP supply chain program. And we've always kind of fostered this collaborative approach. Once we really understood our needs as an organisation, then we started communicating these requirements to suppliers. And this is years before we thought about putting them in the contract clauses. And what we did was we started embedding them into our procurement process. So things like our supplier code of conduct, into our RFX questions. Into our tender evaluation. So when we're making those procurement decisions, and then probably the final step that we've really taken is then to say to the supplier, well, we've been talking about this with you for the past couple of years. Now we would like to put this into a formal contract clause. And we've been taking very much a category approach in procurement to do this. So we have 10 categories, and we've been looking what are the highest emitters in each of these categories to be able to introduce these clauses. So being able to prioritise those high emission areas as a starting point. Some of the other mechanisms that we've used within our organisation, I mentioned we got this category level. We also have procurement category owners at Telstra. So placing incentives and targets for them as well as broader incentives across the organisation to help drive the type of purchasing behaviour that we're after.
No, fantastic. One of the things that I'm always really curious about, as someone who's an ex-outsourcing lawyer and spent a lot of time negotiating with suppliers and in supply chains, is how we get things through the negotiation process. I think that corporates have set amazing targets. We and other people out there have started creating clauses to make those targets a legally enforceable obligation. That's the reason you put something in a contract, isn't it? But I'm also very keenly aware from my time that what survives the negotiation process is a very, very different thing to the model clause that starts it all. And so I really wanted to kind of cycle back to you, Colin, because I know that you have engaged in that negotiation process. If we want to be successful in making sure that these clauses stay in, that they're not watered down to the point of uselessness, what do we need to do? What did you do?
Thanks, Becky. I've been thinking about this, and I think Mike Tyson said that everyone's got a plan until they get punched in the mouth, which is a bit extreme for contract negotiation, but is probably an analogy that a lot of us would recognise. So I think there's a few elements to it. A lot of what Simon was saying, doing the groundwork internally to get buy-in. So everybody agrees that this isn't a nice to have. This is, like you said, time will run out if we don't do it now. And so making sure that everyone has agreed behind the scenes that this is something that we need in our contracts, and it's kind of, there's that hard line there. Different businesses again will be different, but a lot of our contract negotiation isn't done by the small team of lawyers that I work within, but actually the procurement function do a lot of it. So a lot of work has gone into creating playbooks so that they're ready for what are the likely pushback that you might get from counterparties. What should you say to deal with that? So giving everyone as many tools and as much understanding as possible to understand where the conversation might go and what they should say to try and cut it off there. Again, everything's got to be in the real world. You may not on a call on a contract get the other side to agree to where you're coming from. There's then an escalation process. So those clauses aren't allowed to change unless they've got sign off from senior management in procurement. But as part the answer isn't always no when it gets escalated. Some suppliers we find are very sophisticated, are far down the road with their own transition plan, and so if they put something in front of us which encapsulates what they're going to do, by what dates, and there are clear commitments to that, we can work with it. But so I think the key is when the things get escalated is making sure that concessions are made because the end goal will be met, and not because we've been punched in the mouth and it's just a difficult call, and that's where we feel that it has to go.
Thank you very much, Colin. And I think that supplier engagement piece, which all of you so far have touched on, is such a key part of this. The end state, the goal that we have in mind is that these clauses go into a contract and that decarbonisation actually happens. That's where the kind of the gold is. And so all of that preparation is so key to making sure that happens. I see that we've had a question in from Jonathan Harris. Thank you very much. What are the panelists' views on how EU legislation is going to influence this, such as the CS3D and the German supply chain law? Has anybody got any views on those?
I'm happy to go. Becky? I was just going to say, I think that the introduction of legislation is definitely going to be able to support a lot of the actions that we're doing. Certainly, I find in different geographies it's easier to do things, especially when it's being legislated. But definitely don't wait for it. Like you said, there's a time bound race against the clock here. I would definitely encourage companies to start doing, because there's a lot of additional benefits other than just the contract clauses that come out of this work.
And I think just in general, any type of government signals around this. So, when the UK government introduced the requirement that if you're bidding for a UK government contract over 5 million, you need a carbon reduction plan. Absolutely fantastic. We need government procurement. We need that kind of push and help as well. So it's not just companies, but we have policymakers supporting what we're trying to do as well.
I think that's right. And one of the things that I would say is that what I have noticed over the years that I've been working in climate is that as companies have signed up to targets and net zero targets, either 2050, 2040, some even 2030, what is painfully apparent is that those companies' targets are running very far ahead of where the legislation is. And I see contracts as the ideal way for closing the gap. Now, the new CSD3 and the German supply chain law are absolutely helping to close that gap, but they're still with, those companies who've got robust net zero targets are still running ahead of even CS3D and the German supply chain law. So it's closing that gap, but we still need contract clauses to close it all the way. I think the other thing I would say as well is that the beauty of contract clauses is that they are so bespokeable. You can make them really tailored to your specific relationship with your supplier. You can say, okay, well, the German supply chain law coming in is doing this, so we can flex our contracts to push it even further and get an inch even faster towards our target. I was going to just go to Gabrielle again now, if that's okay, and say, as a corporate, why would you want to take the lead in this area? I've just talked about how we've got companies setting net zero targets so far in advance of where even today's legislation is. Why would you want to do that instead of just sitting back and doing basic compliance?
Yeah, and I think part of it is, we want to be ahead of regulation, so we want to be prepared. But I think what has also really changed in the past few years is the increased focus on sustainability credentials that we're seeing from investors, that we are seeing from customers. So, for us now, up to 30% of an RFP can be on our sustainability credentials. And that's really, changed the focus. Now, everybody wants to talk about sustainability, whereas in the past, something niche that Gabrielle did over there in a corner kind of thing. But now, everybody is talking about it. Our customers want to have seminars on it. So I think that's really changed. And of course, we also see it with employees, with employee retention, why they're picking various companies. But when it comes to contract clauses and engaging with suppliers, it's a very positive way to engage, I guess, when you start talking about sustainability and what you're trying to do around innovation, around carbon reduction. It's not just about SLAs and quality and process. It's an opportunity to collaborate, I think, in a different way. So, looking at innovation, for example, So I don't know, for people in the UK, if you were a BT customer, you would get this broadband router, which was a square kind of box thing that came in a very glossy, nice box. And we ran this innovation challenge to focus on carbon reduction. And our supplier came up with a new design for this broadband router. So instead, it's actually flat and it's got little legs on it. And that meant that it could fit in people's letterbox. So people, if they weren't at home, they didn't have to miss the post office delivery. It could be slotted through. And we did innovation looking at, let's get rid of the glossy kind of packaging. Let's just do paper packaging. Let's get rid of the instruction booklet and just print the instructions on the box itself. So, innovating around really kind of neat ideas around carbon reduction. And I think that is also why we want to do this, because we see new ideas, we can drive efficiencies, we can use less resources. I mean, and for us, this is, also less truck rolls, for example. We don't need people out and about as much. So there are lots of benefits.
Fantastic. And is there what sort of shifts are we seeing at an industry level, I think, is the next question I wanted to ask. Probably I'll ask you, Simon, because we've talked a bit about where legislation is and where individual corporates are positioning themselves. But of course, another critically important group for helping to plug the gap between where legislation is and where corporates are is industry level groups. What's your experience of that?
Yeah, well, Gabriella and I both work for telecommunication companies, and in the industry in particular, there's significant overlap in the supply chain. So it almost requires a cross-sector collaborative approach when working with our supply chain. Because we don't want to get the scenario where one organization's asking for something completely different to the others. So, it can be really difficult for us as operators, but also for our suppliers, a huge challenge. So we've been working with a number of our key suppliers and industry partners on Scope 3 emissions. So one significant piece of work that's occurred recently is there's been an alignment around Scope 3 reporting. So 3 organisations, so the GSM Association, the Global Enabling Sustainability Initiative, and the International Telecommunications Union came together with their members to draft a Scope 3 guidance for telecommunication operators. So that outlines things like the requirements, what type of data we require from our suppliers. From those types of requirements, then we can start to work on things like, well, how can we have common language in what we ask of our suppliers as well? So Gabrielle and I are both part of the Joint Alliance on CSR. They engage with suppliers historically around performing site audits, so around largely human rights. But there's organisations seeing a need for also collaboration on other CSR topics, such as climate change, and there's been a report released by them called Gabrielle may be able to correct me, but the That Climate Change Report. And so we've been having sessions with suppliers to educate them about what we as an industry require from them.
And it's really coming together, with a joint call to action about, this is what suppliers can do and this is what we would encourage you to do.
I think it's one of the things that makes working in the sustainability space more interesting, that for us, usually we're terrified of speaking to other banks about anything, but competition law realizes that the kind of common good of every industry becoming more sustainable. So it is relaxed, and you will get better ideas by collaborating with others. And so, yeah, it's a far more collaborative space than what we tend to find at an industry level.
I'm particularly interested in industry collaboration on carbon reporting standards, because it's the sort of thing where at the moment it's a bit of a wild west. I don't see any, someone can obviously correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't see any particular competitive advantage to having a proliferation of different carbon reporting standards, because it doesn't feel that we're vying for the best one. It feels that people are just trying to find their way through this absolute dense forest of information. And so really kind of coalescing around an industry standard for that in particular, which would make it, I presume, much easier when you go to your suppliers and say, right, now we're putting a clause in this contract that you will report on your carbon, you report using these metrics, industry standard metrics. And it's certainly something I've heard from suppliers as a real barrier for them, having 30 different reporting regimes from 30 different customers, 30 different reporting dates, and that being a real or unnecessary expense. And I think that leads me quite nicely onto folding Emily into this conversation, because some of these things that we've been talking about are brilliant, but it's only going to be the really large corporates with very sophisticated ESG teams that can deliver them. So what does all of this mean for SMEs, Emily?
Great, thanks so much. And just for those who might have joined a little bit late, I am alone on this panel, not a sustainability expert, but we at ICC have historically, and especially in the last 5 years, really ramped up our focus on helping SMEs, because we're a membership organization. We have national committees in about 90 countries, but we also have a huge network of companies through chambers. So we like to say we have 45 million companies, something like this. Obviously, a huge proportion of those are going to be micro, small, and medium-sized entities. And so we're keenly aware that in the best of times, when you are a tiny company with very few resources, doing anything is pretty hard. And the proliferation, although it's a wonderful thing in the abstract, of reporting requirements, not just on sustainability, but on compliance generally, on a range of topics. The number of topics keeps growing, the kinds of reporting that needs to be done. And it's very, very difficult for SMEs to even orient themselves. We're hearing more and more. We've been talking about this in particular the past couple of months, the kind of general compliance challenges. And so, right, everyone's facing them. Who cares? Our real concern is that there will be a big band of companies around the world that are just going to give up. They will not be able to participate in international trade in these huge global value chains because they literally don't know where to start. They're cowed. Sustainability, as we all know, and as has been mentioned, is one of the more historically known. I mean, it's been taking years, but that will not come as a surprise. But I'm very encouraged. I'm just going to have some sort of impressionistic thoughts about what I've been hearing. Really, really encouraged about the care that you big corporates on this call are evidencing in, supplier engagement, just the kind of knowing that you need to really hold out a helping hand in a lot of ways, even as you're asking for things and requiring things. But that's kind of, I think a lot of companies feel completely alone. So we at ICC are trying to find ways to provide tools, to provide services, to sort of get information in a single place, so people don't have to run around. I mean, it's enormously complex. And then, as has been mentioned, even once you know what you're supposed to be doing, there may be very, very annoyingly close, but not the same reporting requirements. So as you said, Becky, 30 suppliers, or, we hear from someone, 4 different tax authorities in a single jurisdiction, each needing a little bit, So there's a lot of work to be done on this. Here's my moment to take a huge shout out for Chancery Lane, because I've got to say, I'm in awe, really. I mean, I encourage everyone on the call, go to the website, enormously valuable, substantive stuff. There's a great 7-minute video that you can watch that kind of lays it all out. And one of the things that's so impressive is that it's this collective of an enormous amount of global, expertise all coming together, this kind of community. That's how we have to support SMEs. So just 2 last thoughts. One is a lot of this discussion has been and presumably will be about lessons that you guys who are deep in this, years into this journey, if you will, have learned about this. And obviously you're funneling that into your supplier engagement protocols. You're negotiating, you have your playbook about what to do in a negotiation if the clause you propose isn't wanted. But it's so easy when you're an expert in something to forget how expert you are. So any learnings that come out of this stuff for the companies that aren't yet on this journey, but they will be, and we want to help them into the pipeline or whatever you want, pathway, whatever. these lessons will be useful to them down the road. Say like, oh, you'd think it would be this, but not this. So we should also keep that in mind, how we can help transmit that information. And the very last thing I'll say is, on sustainability, this is sort of a plug for an ICC tool, or just information about an ICC tool. A few years ago, ICC started partnering with a company called GIST Impact, G-I-S-T Impact, and we created a sustainability reporting tool whose aim is to help small companies become greener and become more sort of in the mix with all of this. It's got 5 pillars: measure, analyze, benchmark, set pledges, and take action. So it's both very practical and it's sort of aspirational, and it helps with data collection and data analysis, and it provides some information that will allow transparency. I think that would make it more, that any company involved be more appealing, and there's a certification piece that would lend some credibility. So if you want to have any information on that, ICC website, GIST Impact website, but I'll leave it there. But this is just, I can't tell you how encouraging it is to hear what you guys are all doing for small companies.
No, thank you, Emily. And I think that's the key, isn't it? We all have supply chains, and those supply chains are made up of companies of all sorts of different sizes. And there may be some of your absolutely critical expert suppliers who are incredibly small. And so how do we help them along the journey? Because if we don't bring them with us, then we're not going to meet our targets. I think that's the thing here. We are all in the same boat, and our relationships are really intimately connected. So I'm going to ask Gabriella first, but then sort of throw it open to the floor. So how are we helping SMEs help us to meet our targets?
Yeah, I think just going back to some of the things that Emily mentioned, if we look at our suppliers, we've got about 12,400. Sadly, we can't engage with all of those on a one-to-one basis. And there were some typical questions coming from SMEs around, well, where do you even start? What is a carbon footprint? How do you do this? And at BT, we've had a carbon reduction target. I mean, measuring our carbon since 1992, so over 30 years. So we do have some experience in this area, and there are other companies like that as well. So we set up something called 1.5 supply chain leaders. We set that up with IKEA, Unilever, Ericsson, and Telia, who's another telco in Sweden. And we did this because we wanted to share best practice. We've been through this. We've done this. So how can we help take some of this pain away? And then we work together with the ICC Exponential Roadmap Initiative and others to set up the SME Climate Hub. We just wanted one place where people could go just to have a look at the basics, and really around reporting, around measurement, around how to communicate, how do you get board approval. So we've done a number of guidance documents. So I recommend people, SME Climate Hub, 1.5 supply chain leaders, which also has a guide on there on how to engage your suppliers. So for some of the bigger corporates and others as well, how do you start talking to your suppliers about this?
Colin and Simon, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, so I think building on what Emily said, that it's making sure that the ask is proportionate. So, I mean, we're very proud that we think the first bank to include these types of clauses, but actually what we ask for is that suppliers work with our sustainability ratings partner, undergo an assessment and agree a plan with them. So that plan flexes. If you are an SME and you're in the early stages, we will recognise that in terms of the obligations which we then set, which you're contractually committed to. So we're conscious that you can't solve the climate crisis by being a big organisation and trying to just pass all obligations on to SMEs in your contracts. We do need to work collaboratively, and had we just tried to force, I don't know, an 8% reduction year on year on everybody, I'm sure it wouldn't have worked. So making sure that the ask is proportionate, I think, is absolutely key. Anything from you, Simon, as well?
Yeah, I think some really similar points that we've taken within Telstra. Probably one thing that I think we all need to remember is 1.5 is very much our North Star. So whenever we're kind of approaching suppliers, you know, as I said before, one size doesn't fit all. You think really practically about, well, what's going to help us achieve those objectives, and asking, you know, a SME to complete all this reporting sometimes isn't, you know, going to give us the biggest impact. So we have to really focus on where we're going to see the biggest impacts. A lot of times it's, you know, maybe start simple and work along that maturity curve, especially, you know, with those SME organisations. There is going to be, you know, a lot of hand holding, so you need to find out, you know, where can you know, give them the biggest value. But definitely, I'd also recommend have the conversations with them. There's a lot that you can learn, and definitely don't let, you know, perfection slow your progress in this area. I think once you really kind of understand their organisation and areas a lot better, then it's going to really help you clarify, you know, how you can support them, and what do you really, you know, require from those SME organisations.
Yes, and I've heard other innovative solutions as well. I'm aware that there's a corporate that has a sort of a two-tier due diligence system where they ask less complicated questions of their SMEs than they might much larger corporates who are already much more sophisticated in this space, but with the idea that over time you will help them get up the curve. And I also hear some wonderful things about education in this space. You know, one of the things that I always say is that if you are running internal climate education for your staff, you can absolutely invite your key suppliers to attend that webinar as well, so they're being educated to the same level as your staff for no cost. Or no additional cost. I've seen a great question come through from John Taylor, which I think is really, really important and very relevant. How do you address greenwashing by suppliers? Does anybody want to field that?
So again, greenwashing is a very hot topic here. I think we're more focused though on us. There's also the HSBC case around about some of their advertising, and that got them into trouble. So for us, like, the key is the messages that we put out there and being transparent, and the more that we can standardise reporting, the easier that becomes. Ultimately, though, there's always a reputational risk with suppliers. So I think we're going to come on to enforcement. It's the type of thing that would make us really concerned, depending on what the nature of that greenwashing was, and might force us to look at maybe enforcement routes and whether or not that supplier continued to be a good fit. So in summary, I think the main greenwashing risk still sits with us. We control the messages that we put out there, and we can do work to make sure that that's safe. Yes, suppliers may greenwash, but that's more likely to impact our relationship with them rather than probably cause risk for us.
Maybe. Oh, sorry, Gabrielle, go.
Oh, sorry.
No, go for it.
I'd add to that maybe, you know, around public reporting. So that's something that we insist on for our bigger suppliers. You know, I don't want my supplier to send me their carbon footprint data and what they're doing. You know, put it out there publicly so others can see it as well, and to show your commitment. I think also annual reporting on how you're progressing against your targets. And also this around a climate transition plan. You know, how are you going to get there? I think part of this greenwashing has been by companies coming out and saying, yeah, I'm going to be net zero in 3 years' time. But they don't tell you how. They don't tell you what the progress they're making. They don't do anything publicly, which also means that you know, some of the challenges we can't address together. So we know for us as BT, one of our biggest challenges is around converting our fleet to electric vehicles. But we need to let people know about that, because we can't, this is not something we're going to be solving on our own, right? We're not going to install all the electric charging points in the UK. So we need to highlight this is a challenge. This is where we're struggling. And I think you know, greenwashing, just reporting publicly, being transparent, and having an annual reporting cycle.
I think that actually contract clauses is one of the areas where we really can tackle greenwashing, because once you put something in a contract, it becomes a legal obligation. So if you put into a contract, you're going to report according to this best-in-class reporting regime that we have, then suddenly you're going to be getting that data. Then you can put a clause in that contract that says, oh, okay, the carbon footprint for this contract is Y, and we expect Y to reduce by X% year on year, and that will be shown in the carbon reporting figures. And yes, okay, obviously at some point someone can manipulate those figures, but I mean that's the best that we can do at the moment with the sort of the art that is available to us. And but so I'm a real big advocate for saying actually one of the ways that we can show people aren't greenwashing is if they're on the hook legally to do carbon reduction in their contracts, and then you can see whether they're doing it or not. This does feel like a good time to move on to talking about incentives and enforcement, because you can put a clause in a contract, but what if somebody doesn't meet what they are required to do? How do we deal with that, Colin?
So yeah, we all like a good corporate cliche thing when it's a carrot and stick territory here. So we've struggled with what are the carrots in this space to encourage suppliers to move in the way that we want, and we've struggled. We looked at coming up with maybe some complex gain shares for our contracts, but when we're trying to have a process that works for everyone, that's been a struggle. So building what Gabrielle said earlier, I think our main incentivization is, like, if you want to be in our supply chain and we're a big company, then you need to do this stuff, and therefore we've not really gone too much further than, well, like Simon was talking about, and Gabrielle as well. It's a big part of the waiting and the procurement process to get on board. You need to be doing it well, and to stay with us, you have to be making progress. And so far it seems to have worked. We're gathering data all the time. One of the points for us is we expect that our climate clauses will become, we say, a darker shade of green as we go along this journey, and it's just working out when's the right point to like re-engage with suppliers, or like our standard contracts, make sure that it's version 2, because just reflecting the progress that we've made or issues that we've encountered. So for incentives for us, that's where we're at. I think more broadly, again, point to Chancery Lane, there's loads of good starting points on there you can do. It's going to be commercially driven. So how do you make it more attractive for suppliers? That might be gain share, it might be the pricing increase if certain targets are made, but there's all sorts of clever things that you can do, and financially is obviously, you can't lose sight of. That's what's important to businesses. On enforcement, again, happy stories so far that it seems to be working well the way that we are engaging, but ultimately I said it's pretty soft what we ask for, but it is backed up by a termination right. I think that's important, because we can't be stuck with a supplier who's managed to get through the procurement someplace, or is non-cooperative and just isn't making progress. So they do have teeth in that. We do insist on making progress, and we may have to make some tough decisions if we have some bad experiences.
I think that's the key for me, is that the beauty of putting these things in contracts is that suddenly the whole suite of how we enforce any behaviour or incentivize any behaviour in a contract is now open to you as a lever to use to help you meet those climate targets. So, you know, I love when you talked about the gain share clause, because I think carrot is really important, particularly if you are in high risk, low margin industries. Liquidated damages regimes aren't going to cut it. And I know that the Environment Agency has used our clauses as a case study about it on our website, but they repurposed it to say, if you better the carbon footprint of this contract, then we'll give you an uplift in price, rather than saying, if you don't meet the carbon footprint, we will apply liquidated damages. But termination rights, of course, and I'm also a fan, as you've mentioned, of sort of the softer things that sit outside the contract. You know, somebody persistently is unable to meet your climate needs and your climate targets and your climate goals. Why are they on your supplier list? That sort of thing. Has anybody else got anything around how you deal with the sort of incentivization piece here?
Maybe just one example that we've had is that we find, especially in the case of a tender, and we did have a scenario where we had 5 of 6 suppliers, agree to the clause, it all of a sudden sets, a bit of a benchmark, and that becomes, the new norm of doing business. That scenario, the 6th supplier still couldn't commit, but we certainly, we recognised that, they're at a different level in their maturity curve. However, we still need to see a plan in terms of how are they going to be closing the gap if they're going to continue providing those services.
I was going to move on. I know that we've got 9 minutes left. I was going to move on now to some lessons learned and unintended consequences. I know that, Gabrielle, you're going to lead us out on some lessons learned you've had from this process. So I'd really love to hear them before we go.
Yeah, I think, as I said before, this about customer requirements, using your purchasing power. I think for us, having that customers coming to us being a customer of our suppliers, and really using that as much as you can. And that means working with procurement, working closely with our procurement team, having our buyers involved, having them drive this, that whole key stakeholder involvement and buy-in, and working together with our suppliers on this, because this is difficult. You need to work together to identify the opportunities. If we're further along on our journey, what do we know? How can we help? So I just wanted to give a couple of specific examples of a contract clause implementation for us. So one is a company in the UK, a contractor for us, and they drive about and dig up roads and things like that for us to lay fiber. So a lot of their emissions came from their fleet. Obviously, we have fleet experience and decarbonizing fleets. So we worked with them to look at, could you for BT, could you establish some regional hubs? Could you shorten your journey somehow? How do you switch to lower emission vehicles? What can you do about your IT equipment? So that suppliers, we saw a 7% emissions reduction. We worked with Ericsson, so one of our big suppliers, and looking at the manufacturing of our products. They convinced one of their sub-suppliers with a factory in Poland to switch to renewables. So that drove down the carbon footprint for the products that we buy from that factory from Ericsson, which actually isn't that big of a volume. But then you look at the additional effect, because we are not the only telco buying this product. So we've actually helped the other telcos reduce their scope 3 emissions as well. So I think even if you're looking at your project and the change seems kind of small, it does add up, because this supplier would have other customers as well. And this is all very replicable. So, you learn from something, you share best practice, you inspire others to do the same thing.
Wonderful. And Simon, I know that you were going to talk about unintended consequences you've seen of putting these sorts of things into contracts. And I'm quite intrigued by that. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, there's a number of different unintended consequences. As I mentioned, one can be that it sets this new benchmark across suppliers, and that this is now the new norm of doing business. We also find it's this may surprise you, but it's a great conversation starter. That may be something funny to say when you're talking about contracting with suppliers. However, when we kind of started on this journey, and we still do, we have, a lot of procurement team members are leading these conversations, but they're not always very comfortable, because this is something very new for procurement. It's a new skill set that they're having to develop. However, we found, we put these clauses in, they had something to discuss with the suppliers, but then the suppliers would come back with, oh, hang on, Telstra's really interested in this. Look, we've got this great alternative product that we can provide to you. And then they're all of a sudden, really excited to be able to share what they're doing to reduce their emissions. And at the same time, we're also learning from our suppliers and continuously developing our process. One thing was around travel emissions. We've been speaking with our consultancy suppliers around that, in looking at how they reduce their travel emissions, and they introduced us to a whole new type of way of considering the emissions from travel that allows us to then start to reduce them as well. One other great thing is it does have a bit of a domino effect. So we found that suppliers, like I said, are more likely to provide us with with products that have lower emissions. But then they also start to decarbonize their own supply chains as well. So when we started that CDP supply chain program in Australia, we were the first organisation utilising that program to engage with our suppliers. We've now seen a lot of suppliers start to pick up that program, replicate it, and start engaging with their suppliers. So that's, I think, really cool to see, is that, domino effect.
That's fantastic. I'm aware that we've only got 5 minutes left. Any final thoughts, Colin and Emily, from either of you?
Sorry, this is very brief. Again, I'm just so encouraged, and this really just the spirit of this, hear from the SMEs that are struggling, and then the spirit of this to say, no, really, we're all, as you say, domino effect. We have conversations, we collaborate. So I am just coming out of this feeling very, very inspired and thankful. So thanks.
Yeah, I think similar, and also, I mean, we're talking about the supply chain. We see the other side too in terms of the lending we do to companies, and just that we see a real growing focus on that. We're thinking about things like systems change. So how do we as a bank support technologies that are going to cause breakthroughs to help with all reduced scope 3 across the board? And it can feel daunting and a bit much sometimes as a subject, but it is good to see the other side of progress being made and the priority which is being given. And today's session has been quite uplifting in that.
That's wonderful. I was just going to do a very quick plug, since so many of you wonderful panelists have mentioned the Chancery Lane Project. We are a non-profit organisation that puts out contract clauses and tools for putting climate-related clauses into your contracts for free on our website. We're funded by philanthropic granting money, so everything we do is freely available for you to use as you see fit, bespoke it, take it apart, make it better. That'd be wonderful. And I don't think there's any more questions, so I would love to say thank you very much to the panelists for coming and just giving us a really, really rich and practical discussion on contracting, which could be quite a dry subject, but I hope has been full of actual great solutions and takeaways for everybody on the call.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Becky. It's really been interesting. I'm finding it very interesting over the yesterday and also today, just the variety of all of the different job title stakeholders that are involved now in this journey. And, you know, from anything from procurement, finance, ESG teams, legal experts, you know, we've had a very big range of job titles. I think, you know, people that are obviously involved in this area, which is really encouraging, because that's exactly what I think we all need to be doing, is more collaboration across sectors, and also, you know, internally as well, different business units coming together to drive all this forward. And one thing was quite apparent from yesterday and today is time is of the essence, and, you know, just get started if you haven't already. So thank you ever so much for today. Like Becky says, in the chat room, we have put links in there for you to some practical tools. The Chancery Lane Project website, which has got I had a look this morning, has got so much useful information on there, so do check that out. Also, please kindly complete our event survey. We'd love to hear your thoughts and opinions on some of the subject matters that we're covering over the next 3 days. We are covering quite a lot of rich content, and I'm very conscious that each session could actually be a one-day conference in itself. But it's our first year doing this, focused on sustainability for 3 days. So if you can let us know your thoughts so that we can then tailor it for next year and really pick out the most important sessions, that would be great for us. The next webinar is taking place at 3 o'clock UK time, which is on plastic pollutions. We've just got a new speaker for that session as well from Lego. So please do join us at 3 PM UK time. And thanks again. See you soon.